الحمد لله خير الماكرين الذي قدر كل شيء والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الذي لم يظن عن ربه إلا حسنا. فأما بعد, all praise is due to Allah, greatest of planners, who had decreed everything with certainty, and peace and blessings be upon his messenger, who had not thought of his Lord except goodness. And so, this channel had started out as an alternate history channel with What If Al-Andalus had industrialized. But as I said in my update video, succeeding videos were delayed. This was actually meant to be the second alternate history video after that. As with the Al-Andalus video, we will be examining and envisioning an alternate timeline, and how much worse things could be had Allah not decreed it as He did so in our timeline. The Battle of Manzikert was a significant event that dramatically set the course of history by throwing the Roman Empire into permanent decline, inciting the Crusades and paving the way for Turkish empires. So what if it didn't happen? The Battle of Manzikert was fought on August 26, 1071 between the forces of the Seljuks and the Romans, under the leadership of Alp Arslan and Romanos Diogenes, respectively, resulting in a decisive Turkish victory, which was immediately followed by civil war and more Turkish invasions. Despite common misconception, the Romans were actually the aggressor in this battle, and the Seljuks were not expecting a Roman invasion, as there was a contemporary truce between the two empires which Diogenes had subsequently broken. It's likely that Diogenes had never planned to keep the truce in the first place, and had only approved it in hopes that the Seljuks would take the opportunity of peace with the Romans to invade the Ubaydids, so that he may launch a successful incursion into Seljuk territory through a surprise attack. Despite their deception, however, the Seljuks were able to swiftly turn around and intercept the Roman force at Manzikert, where they were crushed, and Diogenes was captured and forced to kiss Arslan's feet. Diogenes was allowed to return to Rome, but a pretender had already risen in his absence, plunging the Roman Empire into a devastating civil war. In the weakness of the Christian realm, unruly Turkish tribes began to migrate into Anatolia, colonizing the region over the next few centuries. To alter the outcome of this event is simple. Simply have Diogenes keep to the truce. There will thus never be a Battle of Manzikert in the first place. Instead, the Seljuks would have diverted their entire force to invading the Ubaydid Caliphate in Egypt and Syria. The civil wars that happened right after Diogenes' defeat would either not have happened, or if they still did, they would be delayed, and Diogenes' forces would have a better fighting chance. The Turkish tribes that had migrated into Anatolia would still have to migrate somewhere, as they had some friction with the ruling Seljuk dynasty, who sought to be rid of them by deporting them to some newly conquered frontier, and thus, without Anatolia, it is possible that these Turks would have instead colonized Egypt and Syria. Whether these regions would fully Turkify or remain Arabized is difficult to say, but it is likely the Turks would have brought Maturidiyat and Hanafiyat with them, displacing the then dominant Ashariyat and Shafiriyat. Ashariyat, while itself a deviant sect, was not as deviant as Maturidiyat, which was closer to Mu'taziliyah, and somewhat tolerated the Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'at for a time, until they were able to regain prominence under the leadership of Imam al-Mujaddid Muḥammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab and Amir Muḥammad ibn Saud ibn Muḥammad ibn Muqrin, rahimahum Allah. May Allah have mercy on them both. However, there is no guarantee that the Maturidiyat will be as tolerant, quashing any potential resurgence of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'at. It is very likely that the Crusades in Syria and Palestine would have never occurred. In an act of desperation, the Roman emperors called upon the Pope and the princes of the West to push back the Seljuks and conquer the Holy Land. However, without Turkish incursions into Anatolia, there would be no reason for the Romans to call upon the West in this timeline. However, the Pope would have still had motive to launch a crusade, as the princes and kings of Europe had been warring with another, and an external enemy could push them towards unity. And with the Scandinavians newly Christianized, this leaves the Muslims of Al-Andalus and al-Maghrib in their direct vicinity. Without the strain of trans-Mediterranean logistics and without the Crusades in the east diverging some of the Christian force, Crusader armies would concentrate all their efforts towards the Reconquista, possibly resulting in the complete annihilation of Islam in Al-Andalus by a much earlier date, and more successful crusades against the Berber Emirates in Al-Maghrib. The 12th century for the Roman Empire was marked by several strong leaders, and without being weakened by the preceding Battle of Manzikert, it is likely that they would be able to expand into Muslim lands, taking Syria, Palestine, and parts of Iraq. Salah ad-Din had risen to power by climbing the ranks of the Ubaidid bureaucracy, deposing the Ubaidid caliph, and uniting the Islamic world against the threat of the Crusaders. A master in politics, soft power, and propaganda, Salah ad-Din was able to frame the Crusaders as a barbaric, genocidal, existential threat to Islam. However, the Romans, who have had prolonged contact with Muslims, did not see them as alien as the Crusaders did, and thus would be more difficult to portray in the same light as the Crusaders, and with the Ubaydids conquered by the Seljuks, there would be no way for Salah ad-Din to rise to power in the first place. The Romans would easily be able to dominate the Middle East from henceforth, potentially even integrating the Abbasid Caliphate as a vassal state to strengthen their legitimacy among Muslim subjects. In the 13th century, the great Mongol Khanate emerged from the Great Steppe, establishing a vast empire stretching all across Asia, penetrating into Europe. With the Seljuks gone and the Romans dominating the region, Hulagu's immediate target would be the Romans. It is possible that if the Abbasid Caliphate was integrated as a Roman vassal, they would defect to the Mongols alongside other Muslim provinces in the resurgent Roman Empire. However, this may not necessarily mean a better outcome for the Muslims, as Hulagu historically favored Christianity over Islam. Without Salah ad-Din, there would be no Ayyubids, and without the Ayyubids, there would be no Mamalik, and thus no Battle of Ain Jalut. The Mongols would thus be able to conquer nearly the entire Middle East, with Constantinople barely saved by the presence of a sea separating Anatolia from the Balkans. Not soon after, the Timurids would enter the scene, conquering the entire Middle East. If the Abbasid Caliphate had somehow managed to survive all this and hadn't converted to Maturidiyya during the Seljuk era, then he'd probably be Maturidi by the end of Timurid rule. When the Black Plague hit in the 14th century, most sedentary empires were severely weakened while nomadic empires thrived. However, as gunpowder was developed and adopted, many nomadic empires found themselves either forced to adapt or pushed back by sedentary empires. Empires like the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, the Polish, etc., which started out as nomadic and later adapted to becoming sedentary urban empires, were the ones that dominated the Old World during the early modern era. However, without any nomads in the direct vicinity of Anatolia, which is now mostly Greek and Christian, no equivalent to the Ottomans ever arises. Severely weakened by the Black Plague, the Romans are also unable to re-establish their empire, but still manage to survive in the Balkans. The Ottomans just not existing would have two notable effects: the dominance of the Safavid Empire and the delay of the age of exploration. The Timurids would eventually collapse, and Iran would be taken over by the Safavids. With the Ottomans just not existing, there would essentially be nothing to keep them from expanding into Iraq and beyond. If the Abbasid Caliphate had somehow managed to survive to this point, the Safavids would be certain to wipe it from existence and purge Sunni Islam from the Middle East. With the Twelvers having finally defeated the Caliphate, the longtime enemy of Shi'ism, they would have been able to establish religious legitimacy to rule over what remained of the Islamic world. And without any real rivals, the Safavids would be able to dominate the Middle East for the duration of the early modern period. The age of exploration was in part spurred by the Islamic powers blocking off the West from Eastern trade as a reaction to the Crusades, worsened by Ottoman expansion into Europe and the Mamluk alliance with the Venetians for a trade monopoly on spices from India. However, without Manzikert, there are no Crusades, no Ottomans, and no Mamalik. In addition, trans-Mediterranean campaigns forced European navies to develop better sailing technology that was well suited to carry troops from all across Europe through the Mediterranean, which meant for some Crusaders in the north having to travel through tough conditions in the North Sea while having the same road-bearing capacity as Mediterranean ships, leading to the development of the ships of the early modern era, which enabled the age of exploration. Without all of these factors, then the age of exploration would be significantly delayed, if it even happened at all. Industrialization was partially influenced by the establishment of a global trade network by European explorers and colonial empires. So in turn, industrialization and the modern era in general would also be significantly delayed by a century, or even a few centuries. Overall, we have a much, much worse world to live in. Deviant sects dominate what remains of the Islamic world, while Crusaders have effectively taken over al-Maghrib, and the Industrial Revolution and thus the modern era is delayed by a significant amount of time. A backwards world where Muslims have lost on almost all fronts. A'udhu billah, Allah indeed is the best of planners, for he had willed the Battle of Manzikert and all its effects from henceforth. Fear Allah and make dua asking that he grant the Muslims victory and preserve us from all threats and innovation. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله ولكم.